In the 1960s in the United States, with the passing of the Civil Rights Act, we saw what many consider to be sort of the official end of the absolute most explicit and formal types of government racism. When we ended mandated segregation, we outlawed many other types of racial discrimination. But since then, and really to this day, Black and Hispanic Americans continue to suffer from a variety of social and economic inequities with regard to wealth, education, health outcomes, cycles of crime and incarceration. The list is a mile long when we're talking about socioeconomic adversities that disproportionately impact populations of color. Over the past 50 or 60 years, in the time since the Civil Rights Movement, we've seen many racial equality movements try to illuminate and put a spotlight on and address these problems. And these movements tend to acknowledge that these problems are the ripple effects of historical institutional racism like slavery and Jim Crow. And these movements have pushed for solutions that are designed to help these groups in particular as remedies for problems that impact them disproportionately. This has taken the form of affirmative action, scholarships for minority students, busing to integrate schools, federal financial support for historically Black colleges, government programs that help minority businesses. These are all forms of action that solve or try to solve race-based problems in the United States. Over the past half century, what we've also seen consistently in parallel is pushback against these racial equality initiatives. Here are a few clips of some popular conservatives making comments which I believe accurately sum up the prevailing right-wing narrative on systemic racism with regard to socioeconomics.
One could certainly say during the Jim Crow era, when African Americans couldn't vote, that's systemic racism. You have things in the system that are contributing to racism. Is systemic racism still a reality today?
It is not a reality. It is the opposite of a reality. It's an illusion. If you can point to me to the law or the practice that's in place that somehow keeps me out, if there's two people that are working the exact same and putting out the same, exerting the same amount of effort, and you're going to tell me that as a Black person I can't get ahead, it doesn't exist.
There are lots of rich Black people in America, and there are lots of poor white people in America.
Oh yeah.
So what? So
yeah.
Because Black people in the United States are disproportionately poorer than white people in the United States, it's actually, it's ignoring the real problem, which is how do we get poor people to be richer?
Systemic racism does not exist. There are no laws in America, meaning the system. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Racism exists. There are people who are racist, and you should do everything you can to show them that their ideas are wrong, and that you should not be judging someone based on their race, of course. But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat Black people differently or Asian people differently or white people differently, simply doesn't exist. If you can get an economy that's as free as possible, you will have more and more people, regardless of the color of their skin, being able to partake in an economy.
So those comments cover a bunch of the predominant views from the right on systemic racism. Those were clips of 3 of the most popular right-wing online broadcasters. So the first thing I want to point out is they are defining systemic racism so narrowly that it would only refer to racism by the government and only the most explicit and official forms of government racism, like Jim Crow, for example. And that's how they're able to say that systemic racism doesn't exist. If someone's constantly asserting something that everyone already accepts as true, such as slavery and Jim Crow no longer exist, it's likely that they're either accidentally or purposefully misunderstanding what they are trying to argue against. That's what's happening here. I've never encountered someone who asserts that systemic racism is a problem today while defining racism in such a narrow way. People usually use the term systemic racism to denote any type of racial biases, formal or informal, by a system or someone acting on behalf of a system, which could take the form of racial bias by police officers or by a law enforcement system, racial bias by people hiring at a company, racial bias in education, like a standardized test that puts certain racial groups at a disadvantage. It doesn't even necessarily have to be racism by an individual, importantly. It could just be a system doing something that in practice disadvantages members of a certain group on the basis of their race. And I think that the concept requiring a little bit of nuance is exactly why some people get confused, some people get defensive about the word racism being involved. So maybe we can have a separate conversation about finding a better term, which is fine. But that's what people mean when they say there is active systemic racism present in the year 2020. So I think a lot of conservatives are confused about the definition if they act as though it's synonymous only with slavery and Jim Crow, or some of them are straw manning in bad faith to avoid actually engaging with the reality on the ground. But the conservatives I played in the clips, what they also seem to be saying is that systemic racism, as someone like me would define it, doesn't exist. Their sentiment is slavery and Jim Crow are over. Black people no longer face any types of disadvantages. There are no systemic biases against black people. There are no lingering effects from historical, institutional inequality, unfairness that still leave the deck stacked against minority individuals. Black and white people on average have identical opportunity to succeed, they would assert. The other thing they seem to be saying is that because they don't believe those racial biases exist, we shouldn't be looking at minority poverty through the lens of race in order to solve it with racial social justice action. They say we should instead look at black poverty, for example, as an arbitrary piece of poverty as a whole, and we should try to solve black poverty merely by fixing poverty as a whole. And in addition to saying that racial solutions to, for example, black or Hispanic poverty are unnecessary, often they will add that those racial solutions dismiss, ignore, or belittle white poverty, and they discount the personal responsibility of non-white individuals to improve their own lives. But it's not surprising that that's the direction conservatives would go, because each of those pieces fits beautifully into the conservative meta-narratives that we've been following. For example, racial inequality is generally overblown. Identity politics is bad. Government intervention is the wrong way to fix anything. Capitalism and meritocracy ultimately are the answers to everything. What conservatives like these are not realizing is that there are social and economic problems today in the United States that affect minorities in specific ways. Black folks as a group do have certain types of particular disadvantages, and to admit that is a reality doesn't mean that you're deriding the poverty of other races or in general. And it doesn't mean you're devaluing anybody's individual responsibility. It doesn't mean that there aren't things we can also be doing generally to help everybody in a situation of hardship, regardless of race. Of course, we want to be thinking about those solutions too. And I talk about those solutions every day. I might even agree with somebody like Ben Shapiro when he says that the mere existence of a black-white poverty gap alone is not necessarily a justification for using race as the context to fix black poverty. The fact that black folks are impoverished at a higher rate than white people by itself might not justify racial solutions, as opposed to solutions that improve the lives of all groups. But what these people on the right seem never to recognize is that certain opportunity gaps also still exist. Not only do black folks in many respects have worse outcomes on average, black folks also have diminished opportunity to improve those outcomes compared to white people on average. That's what these conservatives are missing. And it's the reason why it is actually useful to explore certain solutions that are tailored towards certain particular racial inequalities. In some ways, black and white poverty can be different. There are many metrics that illustrate gaps between a black person and a white person of the same income. There was a groundbreaking study by Stanford and Harvard researchers from 2018, which combined census data on race with IRS tax returns, allowing them to compare the income of parents with the income of their grown children over the span of 1989 to 2015 for the purpose of tracking intergenerational mobility, which is the degree to which children economically surpass their parents or fall behind. And what they found is that downward mobility occurs at a much higher rate among Black Americans than among white Americans when you compare Black and white people with similar incomes. This was true even among the children of higher income parents of both races. Children of white parents in the top fifth of the income distribution have a 41% chance of staying at that income level. Children of Black parents in that highest income level only have an 18% chance of staying at that income level. So regardless of how much money your parents make, if you are Black, you are less likely to achieve the economic status of your parents or higher. Sadly, I can already imagine some people are going to butt in with, oh, well, maybe it has something to do with intelligence or single parenthood or something like that. The study found that the Black-white mobility gap is entirely driven by Black and white males. There was very little gap between Black and white females, which would rule out genetic factors between races as an explanation, if that's your sort of thing to look at. The study also looked at family structure, and it found that the huge gap is there, regardless of whether children came from one or two parent homes, which debunks the conservative idea that lower marriage rates are responsible. But a factor that does tend to powerfully predict economic mobility is the average income of the neighborhood in which a child was raised. A study by Harvard economists published in 2015 showed overwhelming evidence for this. The researchers looked at 16 years of tax records to track pairs of children and parents, and they found that the affluence of a child's neighborhood is the single best predictor of their long-term upward mobility. The amount of money in an area where a child grows up is strongly correlated with that child's ability to achieve more socioeconomic success than their parents. A study was published in 2015 by the American Academy of Political and Social Science, conducted by researchers at Stanford, by looking at census data, which found that among Black and white families with similar incomes, white families are much more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher average incomes. And of course, this means that the white family is more likely to have access to better schools, better childcare, better parks, better transportation options. The list of advantages in a high income neighborhood relative to a low income neighborhood is a very, very long list. And between a Black and white family of similar income, the difference between the average incomes of their neighborhoods is not small. It's huge. So to put all of this together, we have the mobility gap between Black and white people of similar incomes. The mobility of anyone, regardless of race, tends to be predicted by the average income of the neighborhood where they grew up. And we see that a Black family with the same income as a white family is more likely to live in a poorer neighborhood. And that's because Black people tend to live near other Black people, and Black people have lower incomes than white people on average. And of course, that is what we call racial housing segregation, the geographic separation of races. And it is a racial issue. So we've demonstrated one of many examples of a social problem in 2020, which can be usefully analyzed in terms of race, and it warrants racial justice action. The problem is that Black folks have less upward mobility than white folks. The cause of the problem is racial housing segregation, and the solution would be integrating housing to a greater degree. There are so many other examples of social problems today that demand racial justice solutions in education, healthcare, the justice system. I'd have nowhere near enough time in this video to go into each and every one of them. So let's flesh out this example we're dealing with, housing segregation. Before we start talking about solutions to segregation, we should contemplate how the housing segregation that exists today came to be. A lot of people think that people of the same races ended up living in the same areas accidentally or as a result of personal choice. But actually, most of today's racial segregation in every city across America results from explicitly racist government policies. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, many American cities passed zoning ordinances prohibiting Black people from moving onto a block that was majority white. Starting in 1934, the federal government gave white people better access to affordable mortgages while designating Black neighborhoods in cities across America as zones where banks should not offer mortgages. This was known as redlining, which encouraged white people to move to homogeneously white suburbs, and it trapped black people in decaying neighborhoods. Also in the 1930s, the Public Works Administration built tens of thousands of public housing complexes all over the country, all of which had a designation for which racial group was allowed to live there. And almost all of them were either all white or all black. And much of the racial segregation that it caused is still present today. There are plenty of other instances of government mandating racial housing segregation. Deliberate, codified government racism is what gave us almost all of the housing segregation we see today. And now white people and black people are more segregated from one another than white people are segregated from Asian or Hispanic people, as examples, and more so than poor and non-poor people are segregated from one another. And black-white segregation puts a hugely unfair burden on black people. It has much worse effects for a black family living in a black neighborhood who have the same income and education as a white family living in a white neighborhood. The average middle-class black family lives in a neighborhood with a higher poverty rate than the average low-income white person. Segregation also prevents home values from appreciating in black neighborhoods because of white folks' reluctance to buy a home in a black neighborhood, even when all other attributes of homes and neighborhoods are equal, which, by the way, is an example of systemic racism happening actively in the year 2020. And it's a type of systemic racism with a huge impact on black wealth, since someone's home is often their largest financial asset. So the crucial thing here is that higher poverty rates in the neighborhood means lower quality resources for everyone who lives there. Segregation is the biggest barrier between black people and higher income, wealth, better education, healthcare, employment opportunities, and so on. One might even be able to say that today, the government's refusal to integrate housing more effectively to fix the problems that government created originally could itself be another example of ongoing systemic racism in 2020. The government not doing something is just as much a policy decision as the government doing something. Sure, someone like Ben Shapiro can sit back and say, yeah, okay, whatever happened in the past with racism and segregation was bad, but now that the government has stopped actively mandating segregation, we can just wipe the slate clean. We can just blame individual black people for being poor. But that would be a complete misunderstanding of the forces that created these problems and the forces that would be necessary to fix them. Government has a ton of power, obviously, and it used this power to segregate for a long time. That same amount of power would be required to undo it. This is where we get to the distinction between desegregation and integration. Desegregation is when a government stops separating people. Integration is the process of unseparating those same people, which has not happened. So we're currently stuck in a state of segregation. Essentially, in a way, the Civil Rights Act did not accomplish as much as conservatives seem to think it did. It didn't hit the reset button on racial inequality. Racial groups in the United States are not on a level playing field. So what can government do to counteract segregation as a way to give black people more economic opportunity? Well, to start with, we could reinstitute the Obama-era policy of requiring localities that receive federal money for housing to identify and try to remedy housing practices that promote racial bias. The policy that was suspended by the Trump administration, which Donald Trump completely blew out of proportion in terms of what it did. And Donald Trump has made clear that he has no interest in dealing with that issue. And in fact, in his personal past, has a history of racial housing discrimination. Commenting on his elimination of this anti-racist policy, Trump actually tweeted, "I am happy to inform all of the people living in their suburban lifestyle dream that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood. Enjoy." That's another example of institutional racism in 2020, if I've ever seen one. Another step we could take to counter segregation by reducing housing discrimination is to increase the use of fair housing testers, who are individuals who pose as potential buyers and renters, to gather information on possible instances of illegal racial housing discrimination, because this discrimination tends to push black people out of white areas. Tests like these have been funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they've uncovered a staggering amount of racial discrimination. For example, they did a test in Chicago in 2018 and identified racial discrimination 27% of the time. There's some more current systemic racism as an example for you. Nevertheless, HUD does not fund these tests anywhere near the level that matches how pervasive and destructive we've observed this problem to be. We have to be better about enforcing anti-housing discrimination laws that are already on the books. Government could also be bolstering inclusionary zoning policies, which require home builders to make sure that portions of new housing units are affordable to low and moderate income people, to eliminate the financial barriers that often end up keeping poor Black families from finding an affordable home in a good neighborhood. We could also be using more federal housing subsidies to help lower income Black families move into better neighborhoods. The low income housing tax credit could be used to develop subsidized rental housing in non-poor neighborhoods. There is great new research that illustrates that what we have been doing with this has had huge payoffs, especially for the kids of low-income families. There are many other strategies we could be using to disperse Black families so that lower-income households aren't so concentrated. New policies that can be implemented and through better funding and enforcement of initiatives that already exist could be significantly beneficial. But I wanted to explore just racial housing segregation as an example to illustrate some points about systemic racism and how much can be done about it. It's a topic that is always relevant and worthy of a deep dive, but especially right now with everything going on with Black Lives Matter, the discussions around race that are happening over the past few months, while they've had the country's attention, Black folks in the U.S. and allies of all kinds have been trying to shed light on a number of really important problems in the country, things that this country has to start dealing with. It's way overdue. But I'm seeing some people actually confused about what are even the starting points for these conversations. The reality is racism can take many different forms. Some people just have an overly simplistic conception of what racism is. People start talking about systemic racism. Conservatives respond with, I have no idea what you're talking about. We have no more slavery. Jim Crow is over. We ended that a long time ago. So racial injustice no longer exists. That perspective misunderstands deliberately or accidentally what systemic racism is, and it ignores the fact that systemic racism exists and is just another form of racism. We also have to refute the common conservative notion that Black hardships can only be productively discussed in the context of hardship or poverty in general, instead of acknowledging additional racial components that are often involved. There are some issues that are more accurately understood when you take into account racial injustices that may be at play so that you can solve them with specially catered solutions.